Good evening.
It's not on. Mic's not on.
Oh, I need to turn my mic on, huh? Ooh, okay. Wherever it is there. Okay.
No, you on.
Now I'm on. Not too used to this mic. Good evening. Welcome to Spirit of Life Ministries in Sebring, Florida. To our Wednesday night Bible study. You normally have our senior pastor, Helen Sanders, teaching. Tonight it's her husband, fellow pastor, Russell Sanders. And I thank her for the opportunity for teaching today. And we're going to be talking about the biblical feasts. God set up certain feasts for the children of Israel when they came out of bondage. And they're important to us even as Christians today, because every feast that he established had a future purpose as well as a present practical purpose for the Israelites. So we're going to be studying that. Some people say, I'm a New Testament Christian. What do I need all the stuff, laws and rules from the Old Testament for? Well, simply because God had a plan right from the beginning. When Adam and Eve fell, he made a promise then of a Savior. He told Eve, your heel will crush the serpent's head, even though he may bite your heel. That was a promise of redemption. Redemption from the curse of death and sin that had come. So God, little by little, started unfolding his plan from that point all the way to the end of time on earth for us. And what we see is he chose a certain people to represent his name and bring his name before the world. He chose Abraham as the one who would be the progenitor of this race of people. Said you would be the father of many nations. And down through his son Isaac and to his son Jacob, God passed that line of authority, and in Jacob brought forth the nation of Israel. He had 12 sons. That became the 12 tribes of Israel. But we see that there was a lot of preparation that had to be done for them. First of all, they weren't that many people. His son Joseph was given many dreams indicating that God has special purpose for Joseph, that he would rise above his brothers and even his father and mother and be a leader. Because of that, his brothers were very jealous, and they arranged to have him out of their lives. Basically, they threw him in a pit. When a trading caravan came by, they took him and sold him to the caravan, and they went to Egypt and sold him into slavery in Egypt. Okay? So, Joseph was set aside by God for a purpose. It's part of his plan, part of his long-range plan. And, long story short, famine came. His father and his brothers all went to Egypt and found out then that Joseph was still alive, and indeed his dreams that God had given him came true. They were subservient to him. But God raised Joseph up so that his family could come into Egypt and grow as a nation. They went in as 70 people. That was Jacob's entire household, servants and everything, 70. When they came out 400 years later, there was like 2 million men among them. That's how much they had grown. 2 million men, not counting women and children. But God put his stamp upon them, and when he called Moses to bring them out of bondage, now understand the bondage in Egypt represents the slavery to sin. They were not free. They were under subservience to Pharaoh. Okay? And it would represent us being in bondage of sin. God sent a deliverer, Moses, and God appeared personally to Moses. Moses was in the wilderness, taking care of business. He was tending sheep, and God appeared to him in the form of a burning bush. A burning bush? He hadn't seen a bush in the wilderness burning and not burning up. I mean, it was on fire, but it wasn't burning up. So he went over to check it out. And through the burning bush, God spoke to him. Said, Moses, listen, son, you're standing on holy ground. You better take off your feet. And so he had a conversation with God, and God told him that it's time to bring my people out of bondage in Egypt. I've heard their cries. Their slavery is bitter, and it's time now to bring them out. I've chosen you to do it. Moses said, me? Me? I can't even talk straight. We think he's probably a great stutterer. We don't really know what the problem was. He said, God, I can't even talk straight. He said, don't worry, I'll supply you a mouthpiece. He supplied his brother Aaron, who was still in Egypt. But Moses said, listen, God, these people don't even know who you are. Who shall I tell them sent me? God said, I am that I am. Tell them that I am sent you. Now, I am, that means God is simply because he is. God said, who am I? I am. There's nothing more to say. I am, I always have been, and I always will be. Now, in the Hebrew, we in American English, British English, we translate his name as Jehovah. If we want to go more with the Jewish letters, it's often called Yahweh, but Jehovah or Yahweh is I am. I refer to him as the great I am. Now, he set a plan of redemption that goes all the way from the fall of man through Israel, and the feasts point forward to it, and everything eventually goes through the cross of Christ on Calvary, his spilt blood and his redemption, and moves into the church age where we are. And as you see the word, it goes all the way to the end of the world as we know it. God has planned it out. Now, how can we answer people who say, look, I don't need the Old Testament. The New Testament's got everything I need. But you can't really have a full understanding of the New Testament unless you understand what's in the Old Testament and how it relates to us. So that's what we're going to be looking at. God, for his people, to teach them, he established 7 feasts. These were 7 feast days or periods of feasts that God himself ordained. We call it biblical feasts. We call it God's feasts because these were God ordained. Now I will tell you that the Jews have 9 feasts that they celebrate. 7 are the biblical God-given feasts, and 2 of them relate to historical events that's happened over the period of their nationhood. They were those 2, which actually is the first of the 9 and the last of the 9, were not given by God. So they were more for remembering their historical heritage, and they use them as teaching events. Those 2 feasts are Purim, which Purim basically means the Feast of Lots, because it related to Queen Esther, and the casting of lots is where they get the name from. When the king had signed a decree that all the Jews could be killed, all the Jews in Babylon, because Babylon was ruling at that time. But God provided a deliverance. We'll look at that later. And the last feast of the 9 is Hanukkah, and that's one here in America that we hear quite a lot about, Hanukkah. It was not a biblical feast, but it is a Jewish feast, one of their most important ones to them to celebrate. And that goes back to the early Roman rule, when Rome ruled Israel. and Israel was oppressed. And the Maccabees family, they actually revolted against Rome and won battles, won victories to give Israel some freedom from Rome. And so they celebrated that because there were some miraculous victories. So they celebrate that. Usually in December, close to our Christmas. In fact, last year, Hanukkah actually fell on December 25th, the same day as our Christmas. But it varies. It can be anywhere from late November right up into the 4th week of December. It varies according to the Jewish calendar. So those are not the feasts we're going to be really looking at. I mention them because you might hear about them, but they are purely of a historical significance, of no particular significance to us as Christians per se, other than just to know that this is their custom and understand what they're celebrating. In between that is the 7 feasts that God Himself ordained. And I'll mention what those feasts are. We will study them, each one in depth as we go along. Leviticus chapter 23 actually details them all. If you want to turn there in the Bible, we will be reading it. First, I will mention what they are, and then we will actually read the text starting from the beginning of chapter 23 of Leviticus. The first biblical feast is Passover. Then immediately following Passover is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The fourth one is the Feast of Pentecost. And in between the beginning of the unleavened bread and Pentecost is the third one, which is called the Feast of First Fruits. So that's Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, and Pentecost. Now those come in the early part of the Jewish religious year. Passover starts on the 14th day of the first month of the religious calendar for the Hebrews. That usually is falling in March and or April. It varies because it depends upon the moon cycle as to when that actually starts. But in our calendar, what it means is Passover, which starts on the 14th day of their first month of the religious year. Passover can fall anywhere from late March up through like the 3rd week of April. From last week of March to the 3rd week of April, anywhere in there. And then the Feast of Unleavened Bread starts the day immediately after the day of Passover. It starts right away. And that actually extends for 7 weeks. The first week is the most intense. They have a Sabbath on the first day and the 7th day of the first week of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And we will get into that. The sheaf of first fruits. That was one that was given for a delayed basis. It was given to them by Moses when they were in the wilderness. It was given at the same time as the others, but they couldn't celebrate it because they had not come into the promised land yet. So they were told, when you do come into Canaan, when you do take the promised land, that's when you will begin that feast. And then the Feast of Pentecost, which is 50 days after Passover. You have the 49 days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and then the 50th day is Pentecost. And that's an especially important one for the Christian church to know. But we'll learn what it means in significance to them also. And then there's the summer months where, business as usual. They're planting, they're growing their harvest, and so on like that. And then the fall feasts start, and it starts with the first day of the civil New Year. Understand, the Jews have 2 calendars. A religious calendar, which starts in the spring, and a civil calendar for their civil government, which starts in the fall. Usually usually in September. Sometimes it can overlap into October, September-October period. Again, on any of these dates, there's about a 4-week variance from here to there. It could fall anywhere in there depending on where their year starts according to the moon cycles. Their calendar doesn't work the same way ours does. It doesn't have the same number of days as ours. Their calendar year actually has fewer days than our 365. So they have to periodically readjust their calendar. But all these feasts have an application to bring their attentiveness to the Lord God, but it has a future application for us as well, and that's what we're going to be looking at. Now, the fulfillment of the feast in Israel, there's literal historical significance to them. There's prophetic types in there. It often speaks of what God did for Israel, and they are to use these events to teach the children, teach them about their heritage. Now, it is important that they taught, because that's why they can survive today. They taught their traditions, they taught about their feasts, they taught about their laws, and even though they were dispersed in 70 AD and scattered across the nations, they developed synagogues wherever they went and continued to teach their traditions based on their scriptural writings, so that when we got into the 20th century, guess what? They were still around. They didn't have a land of their own, but God did bring it back together in 1917 through the Balfour Declaration. They were allowed to come back to their homeland. And then 50 years later, they got Jerusalem back. When they initially came, they didn't have Jerusalem. They had to establish Tel Aviv as their capital. In the late 40s, they actually gained independence and became declared as a nation. So all of this has been prophetically spoken of. Now, in Christ, the historical fulfillment through Christ impacts us personally. And we can see the types that were cast in the Old Testament becomes reality to us that we can see. We can understand now from a New Testament perspective what the future implication of these feasts were. The Jews back then, they didn't really understand that. They could only see how it applied to them at that time. These feasts often were celebrations, happy, merry occasions. There was one of them that was opposite. It was very somber, very quiet, to reflect on the sinfulness of where they've been and so on like that. But most of them were festive celebrations. Out of those 7 feasts, there were 3 in particular that were stressed as being very important, because the word told the men of Israel come to these 3 feasts every year. They were to come on the Feast of Passover, they were to come on the Feast of Pentecost, and they were to come again in the fall on the Feast of Tabernacles. And they were instructed, when you come to these feasts, don't come empty-handed. Come with offerings. Hey, that's kind of like we might take up an offering in the church, except their offerings were a little different. It wasn't offerings of money. They bring offerings of sacrifices to be made, sheep, bullocks, various animals to be sacrificed. They would bring offerings of grain, food, corn, wheat, things like that. So they were instructed, come 3 times a year to the tabernacle or the temple when it was built, and bring your offerings. So we will look at each of those. The first one we'll be looking at will be Passover. But we're going to first read Leviticus 23, and that touches on all 7 of them. So let's look at the word. Verse 1, chapter 23, Leviticus. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, concerning the feasts of the Lord, which ye shall proclaim to be holy convocations, even these are my feasts. 6 days shall work be done, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of rest, an holy convocation. Ye shall do no work therein. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. Now this established the regular weekly Sabbath, what we call Saturday, the 7th day of the week. This was not a feast, but this was a Sabbath for them to do no work, to rest, and concentrate on the Lord, teach their youngsters, if they were able to take them to a tabernacle or so, and that's fine, but it's mostly done at home. They were not to travel, they were not to do any work, they were not even to cook food. Their food was to be prepared a day ahead of time. So when Saturday, the Sabbath came, which their Sabbath would start at 6 p.m. on Friday, they would not even have to cook. They were not to have any kind of fire or anything like that. The Lord would take care of them. Now, I mentioned about when it would start. Their day, and you need to understand that their day ran a little different from ours. Their day started from sundown and ended at sundown. So, and 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. is what's considered sundown and sunrise. So, their day starts at 6 p.m., runs through that night, and through all the daytime of the next day, and that day ends at 6 p.m. Then the next day starts at 6 p.m. So that's why their Sabbath, it's called Saturday to us, but for them it starts at 6 p.m. on Friday and ends at 6 p.m. on Saturday. Then at 6:01 Saturday, it's Sunday for them. It's the first day of the week. And that's going to come into importance later in some of our understanding about the feast and what God has given us. So verse 3 establishes the weekly Sabbath. Now, starting from verse 4, we establish the 7 feasts of God. Verse 4 says, These are the feasts of the Lord. And in King James, you see the Lord is in all capitals, which means Yahweh or Jehovah or Lord of hosts. These are the feasts of the Lord, even holy convocations, which ye shall proclaim in their seasons. In the 14th day of the first month at even is the Lord's Passover. Now, that would generally most of the time be April in our calendar, but sometimes it comes in at the tail end of March. Okay, and so that's the first. That's the first feast mentioned, Passover. Verse 6 goes right into the second feast. It says, On the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread unto the Lord. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. Now, what is unleavened bread? That's bread that doesn't rise. It has no yeast in it. Or in our cooking, you could say it has no baking powder in it. It's plain bread, the wheat, the flour, the oil, but with nothing to make it rise. And you say, man, that would be a little bit hard, wouldn't it? Well, yeah, it's not soft like our white bread. But here's the thing. It represented purity, because leavening, as we will see in the word, leavening is considered something comparable to sin, because a little bit of leavening in a lump of bread will cause it to rise, because the leavening will go throughout the whole lump. You could take a lump of dough, of unleavened dough, and take just a tiny pinch of dough from bread that has yeast in it, put that little pinch in and knead it and let it sit, and pretty soon that will begin to rise because the yeast will spread throughout. And that's kind of like sin in us. If we allow a little bit of sin in, it can do serious things to us. That's why we are to admonished in the scriptures to be holy as God is holy. It's why we are to be sanctified unto Him. Sanctified means cleansed and set apart unto God's purposes. So, when this feast was established, it said you must eat unleavened bread for 7 days. Now, that means you have Passover, and then after Passover, immediately starts the next 7 days of unleavened bread. That's the first of 7 weeks of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now, in verse 7 it says, "In the first day you shall have a holy convocation, you shall do no servile work. But you shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord 7 days. In the 7th day is a holy convocation, you shall do no servile work therein." Now when they say a holy convocation, they're talking about a Sabbath, a festive Sabbath. So that week, the first day of that week is a Sabbath, and the 7th day of it is a Sabbath. But the 5 days in between, you still eat the unleavened bread. But in the 1st and 7th days of the week, you do no work. So that's the beginning of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now that feast, that period does last for 7 weeks, and every 7th day is a holy convocation. In verse 9, we continue on. It says, "The Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When ye come into the land which I give unto you, and shall reap the harvest thereof, then you shall bring a sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest unto the priest. And he shall wave the sheaf before the Lord to be accepted for you. On the morrow after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it." So, this is the one which gets implemented once they go into Canaan and take the land and start planting and growing crops. That's then their first gleaning of the harvest. Make a sheaf, take it to the priest, and he will offer it unto the Lord. He will do a wave offering unto the Lord. Okay? Now, verse 12 says, "And ye shall offer that day, when you wave the sheaf, a he-lamb without blemish of the first year for a burnt offering unto the Lord. And the meat offering thereof shall be 2/10 deal of fine flour mingled with oil, an offering made by fire unto the Lord for a sweet savor. And the drink offering thereof shall be of wine, a 4th part of a hin." Now when they say meat offering, it's not meat like we're thinking of, like beef or something like that. It means of their harvest, the grains, the flour from their harvest. 14, "And ye shall eat neither bread, nor parched corn, nor green ears, until the selfsame day that ye have brought an offering unto the Lord. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations in all your dwellings." So that is the wave offering, the Feast of First Fruits that we will look at more later. And it's the one without a specific date. It falls anywhere from the beginning of the Feast of Fruits up to Pentecost, whenever the first part of the harvest starts to come in. First part of the spring harvest. They later have fall harvest for what grows through the summer and harvested in the fall. Verse 15, "And ye shall count unto you from the morrow after the Sabbath, from the day that ye brought the sheaf of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths complete." That means 7 weeks, a Sabbath ending each week. Even unto the morrow after the 7th Sabbath shall ye number 50 days, and ye shall offer a new meat offering unto the Lord. 50 days, that's what we call Pentecost. Pente means 5. So that's 5 sets of 10. To me, 10 is number of completion. So that leads us to Pentecost. 17. Ye shall bring out of your habitations 2 wave loaves of 2/10 deal, and they shall be made of fine flour. They shall be baken with leaven. They are the first fruits unto the Lord. So you've had the wave offering. Now on Pentecost, you actually bring and bake the bread, 2 loaves of bread, to bring as an offering unto the Lord. And in this one you put yeast. And we'll look in the reasons for that later. 18, verse 18. And ye shall offer with the bread 7 lambs without blemish of the first year, and 1 young bullock, and 2 rams. And they shall be for a burnt offering unto the Lord, with their meat offering, and their drink offerings, even an offering made by fire of sweet savor unto the Lord. 19. And then ye shall sacrifice 1 kid of the goats for a sin offering, and 2 lambs of the first year for a sacrifice of peace offerings. Verse 20. And the priest shall wave them with the bread of the first fruits for a wave offering before the Lord, with the 2 lambs. They shall be holy to the Lord for the priest. And ye shall proclaim on the selfsame day, that it may be a holy convocation unto you. Ye shall do no servile work therein. It shall be a statute forever in all your generations, throughout your generations. And ye shall reap the harvest of your land, and ye shall not make clean riddance of the corners of the field when thou reapest, neither shalt thou gather any gleaning of thy harvest. Thou shalt leave them unto the poor and unto the stranger. I am the Lord your God, meaning I have commanded it so. This is my commandment. So that completes the Feast of Pentecost. There's a lot involved in it, and we will look at that when we get to examine that feast in particular. 23, verse 23. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, In the 7th month, in the first day of the month, shall ye have a Sabbath, a memorial of blowing of trumpets, a holy convocation. Ye shall do no servile work therein, but ye shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord. Now, they mention it as the 7th month. That would be the beginning of the 7th month of the religious year, but the first month of the civil year. This is what we refer to as the Feast of Trumpets. And then in 26, the Lord spake again unto Moses, saying, Also in the 10th day of this 7th month, there shall be a holy day of atonement. It shall be a holy convocation unto you, and ye shall afflict your souls, and offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord. And ye shall do no work in that same day, for it is a day of atonement, to make atonement for you before the Lord your God. I mentioned out of the 7 feasts, there was one that was not a happy festive occasion, and that's this one. It's the Feast of Atonement. And it's to reflect upon how man fell into sin, how they fell into sin, and how they are going to be redeemed from that sin. Atonement means to be paid for. 29. For whatsoever soul it shall be that not be afflicted in that same day, he shall be cut off from among his people. Now, by afflicted, they mean just severe. Just take it as a very solemn day. It doesn't mean take whips and beat yourself with lashes. That's not what it's meaning. It's a day for repentance, being sorrowful for having fallen away from God. 30. And whatsoever soul it be that doeth any work on that same day, the same soul will I destroy from among his people. In other words, I'll take care of the one who's in rebellion against that day. Verse 31, ye shall do no manner of work. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations in all your dwellings. It shall be unto you a Sabbath of rest, and ye shall afflict your souls. In the 9th day of the month at even, from even unto even, shall you celebrate your Sabbath. Now, you might notice with each of these, he said, teach it to your generations from generation to generation. And that's why they've been able to survive as an ethnic nation, even though they didn't have land. Ethnically, they've been a nation throughout history. And that's why they still were preserved to this day, because they did teach these things from generation to generation as the Lord had commanded. Now, verse 33, again, the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, speak unto the children of Israel, saying, the 15th day of this 7th month shall be the Feast of Tabernacles for 7 days unto the Lord. It lasts for 7 days. On the 1st day shall be a holy convocation. Ye shall do no servile work therein. 7 days ye shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord. On the 8th day shall be a holy convocation, or Sabbath, unto you, and ye shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord. It is a solemn assembly. Ye shall do no servile work therein. Verse 37, these are the feasts of the Lord, which ye shall proclaim to be holy convocations, to offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord, a burnt offering, a meat offering, a sacrifice, and drink offerings, everything upon this day. Beside the Sabbaths of the Lord, and beside your gifts, and beside all your vows, and beside all your free will offerings which ye give to the Lord. Also in the 15th day of the 7th month, which is still the Feast of Tabernacles, when ye have gathered in the fruit of the land, ye shall keep a feast unto the Lord 7 days. On the 1st day shall be a Sabbath. On the 8th day shall be a Sabbath. You shall take you on the 1st day the boughs of goodly trees, branches of palm trees, boughs of thick trees, willows of the brook. You shall rejoice before the Lord your God 7 days, and you shall keep it a feast unto the Lord 7 days in the year, and it shall be a statute forever in your generations. You shall celebrate it in the 7th month. Ye shall dwell in booths 7 days. All that are Israelites born shall dwell in booths, that your generations may know that I made the children of Israel to dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. And Moses declared unto the children of Israel the feast of the Lord. That concludes the chapter. That's an overview of the 7 feasts. Now next week we will start looking at these feasts one by one and see what they meant to the Jews at that time and what they mean to us today, and how all of it passes through the cross of Christ from the old covenant to the new covenant. We look forward to having all of you join us, and we shall all learn. And of course the teacher always usually learns more than the students. So we will continue this series next week looking at the Feast of Passover, which has special lot of significance for us today. Thank you for joining us.